What's up guys, welcome back. Today we will take a look at how to achieve the dirty yellow fabric texture that I painted on this model from the Kingdom Death line. If you're new to the channel, click subscribe and turn on notifications, that way you won't miss out on any future uploads. I was mostly following the concept art for this paint job, and on that they used quite a greeny tone to shade the yellow clothing. An interesting property of yellow is that if you mix black into it, it tends to give you quite a dirty green colour. So rather than find a suitable green paint, I tried to keep it simple and I just grabbed some scale colour Sahara yellow and mixed in some black to darken it down. And you can see that gives quite a green look to it. So here's how that looks once it's on the model. Our strategy here is going to be gradually building up the saturation of the yellow, and then we'll boost the brightness of some of the highlights before going back in at the end to darken the shadows. So to start off, we're going to mix some of the Sahara yellow into the base colour just to make it a bit less desaturated, and we'll paint this onto all the areas where we want to build up a highlight. So the upper part of the creases in the fabric, the belly and the upper part of the bikini top. And I'm not going to worry all that much about getting a smooth blend with this. It's meant to be some kind of fabric, so we're going to add a bit of texture to it as we go along in the process. But for now, we're just blocking the colour in where we want it. When you're painting fabric that has a lot of folds in it, imagine a light coming down from above and try to follow the general flow of the folds, letting them almost guide you in where to put your highlights. Look at some reference pictures of different fabrics. That's going to give you a better understanding of the way light interacts on the surface. So on the belly here, you can see that we have a really obvious edge around the bottom of the highlight. So what we'll do is, using some of that same paint, we'll blend out that hard edge using some stippling. To do that, we're going to apply lots of little dots on the surface, on and around the edge of the highlight, just by gently tapping the tip of the brush against the surface. And that will help to soften out the edge of the highlight, creating a little textured transition between the two colours. If you don't want the texture there, you can use glazing instead, just by pushing a thin glaze of that colour up and over the edge of the two paints, pushing the glaze in the direction of the highlight. And I'll do the same thing here on the breast, applying lots of little dots on and around the highlight just until we soften that edge out. Stippling seems like it should be a super finicky and take a long time to do, but if you actually try it, you'll see that you can soften out a blend surprisingly quickly, and it tends to give you a more interesting quality to the surface that's really hard to achieve any other way. Next, we're going to add a bit more Sahara yellow into the mix, reducing that green colour and making it look a bit more yellow than it was. Now we'll essentially do the same thing again, but this time we'll pull the paint closer to where the light would be catching the fabric. On the folds at the front, that's going to be around the middle here, and we'll also pull it up towards the upper part of the belly. To blend out the highlights on the belly, there you can again use stippling to apply some little dots on and around the highlight in order to soften it out. Mix in a bit more Sahara yellow and we'll repeat the process, this time making our highlights a little smaller than before. So you can see that apart from the stippling, we're using a pretty basic layering technique, just making each layer a little smaller than the previous one as we build up the intensity of the yellow. Just take your time and put your focus into making these creases appear natural. We'll build up the highlights on the bikini top in the exact same way, just placing the colour where we want it to be more intense without worrying too much about blending. And because I'm using scale colour for this, I'll need to apply another layer to make sure it has decent coverage. They tend to be a bit more transparent than other brands, so you need to be pretty mindful of that if you're using them. Once you're happy with the coverage, you can blend out the edges with a bit of stippling, applying lots of little dots on and around the highlight to soften out the join between the two colours. Don't be intimidated by stippling, it's really not that hard. All you're doing is gently and repeatedly tapping the tip of your brush against the surface, leaving behind small dots of paint. You can use this to hide the join between two colours, or to add some surface texture, or even to get a sparkly effect on metallics. It's a really useful technique, so if you've never tried it out, give it a shot, I think you'll like it. When you're doing this, it's a good idea to use a paint consistency that has a certain level of transparency to it. This allows you to control the overall coverage of your dots. Adding more dots in the same general area will increase opacity. Thus, you can decide where to make your colour more or less intense simply by how many dots you apply in any given area. With that in mind, try and place most of your dots in the area immediately surrounding the transition, right where the two colours meet, making the dots tightly clustered and numerous. Then, as you move further away from the join, let your dots spread out and apply less of them so that they become more sparse and spread out. This will allow you to create a nice, soft, gradual transition. I'll highlight the top of the strap as well. That would be catching the light too, so I'll add a bit of yellow up there so that it makes sense. And we'll do the same thing on the other side, just adding a small bit of colour near the top of the strap. Now that we've built up the colour of the yellow, we can start to layer in our brighter highlights. To do that, we'll first mix a little white sand into the yellow just to lighten it, and we'll apply that in the same manner, pulling the paint across the surface of the folds, drawing the highlight up to where we want it to be the brightest. Don't panic if you go outside the lines a little bit. You can always clean that up later with your initial base colour. It's good to always leave some of your previous colours on the palette when you're mixing, because that way you can always go back and revise areas where you've made a mistake, or areas where you simply want to make a change. You'll already have the colours you need on the palette without having to remix them, so it saves you a lot of hassle. On the belly, the highlights are getting really small at this stage, so I'll just apply those with stippling from this point onwards. It becomes pretty easy to cover up a lot of your previous steps, so using the stippling helps to combat that as long as you keep the dots fairly small. Just be sure to use a brush that has a good point and gently tap the tip of the brush against the surface. And try not to press down with the bristles so that you retain the point. If you're gentle, the bristles won't flare out. We'll do the same sort of thing on the bikini too, using stippling to build up the highlights. Try to place your highlights in the same sort of area as the ones on the exposed part of the breasts. That way it's going to look more natural. If the two highlights don't really line up, then it's going to look really odd, so just be careful with that. Add a bit more white sand into your mix and we'll repeat the process, intensifying our brightest highlight spots. There's actually a couple of little holes in the bikini, so we're going to pick them out just with some of the original flesh colour, which if you remember, we used Games Workshop Tallarn flesh for that, and I'll just carefully paint that in. Yep, I think that looks okay. We'll also pick out the edge of the fabric at the tear. We're going to need a strong highlight for that because it's a really small detail, so you need quite a bright colour so that it stands out. And to get that, we'll just mix a bit more white sand into the yellow to make it really quite bright. And we'll use that to hit the edge of the fabric at the bottom of the hole. And I'm using the side of the brush quite near the tip, just letting the brush glance against the edge of the little detail. It's much easier than trying to paint with the tip of the brush, especially on these very small elements. I also want to add an edge highlight along the side because there's actually a subtle raised detail there, and I'll use some of the Sahara yellow for that, just to pick out the edge. And you're going to see that I make a complete mess of that, mostly because when I'm painting on camera I actually can't see what I'm doing, so most of these smaller details become near impossible to paint. But I gave it a go anyway. I think I went back later off cam to clean that up a bit. I'll also do the same thing on the other side. Just picking out those edges and trying to leave a thin dark line on either side so that the highlight stands out. Alright, so we'll go back to painting the lower half again with a bit of a brighter highlight this time, again just by mixing some white sands into the yellow. So I'm mainly hitting the tops of each little fold, just anywhere that I want to make it brighter really. You don't need to hit every single one if you feel that some should be lighter than others. So maybe there's some areas that would be catching less light. It really depends on the model that you're working on. Add a bit more white sands in there and we'll go back for some final highlights. You can see we're using stippling on its own to apply these smaller highlights. And you should notice that the texture is starting to come through now. It might look a bit gnarly when we're zoomed in like this, but remember that the model is pretty small. So when you pull back a bit and see it in context, you don't really notice the dots as much. So this is just the same as the previous step, but we're making the dots really quite small now and just trying to hit the very brightest points of the highlights that you've been building up over the last few steps. We'll also add a single highlight onto the bikini just where the nipple would be. You could also add a subtle shadow underneath that too, but I think that's a bit overkill. I mean, the cast is probably gratuitous enough as it is. Alright, so that's the highlight basically done. We can move on to the shadows now. For that we're going to take some scale colour brown leather and we're going to add a bit of the red leather that we used on the hair, just so that the brown isn't quite so boring looking. And we'll thin that down with a bit of water to a thickish glaze consistency. Then with hardly any of the glaze on the brush, we'll place it on the lower side of the breast. Then quickly grab a second clean, slightly damp brush and just tease the edges of the glaze upwards. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. Drawing the edge of the glaze up with the second brush helps to create a softer blend and stops you getting that horrible mark at the edge of the glaze when it dries. And we'll do the same sort of thing into the recesses of each crease to make the shadows darker. You can build these up over a few layers until you're happy with the way they look. I also went back later with this colour and lined around the edges of the bikini, but I did that part off cam because it was really fiddly and I had to have the model quite close to my face so that I could see what I was doing. Alright guys, so that is how you paint this interesting yellow fabric. I think it's pretty effective, it matches the concept art fairly well. Hopefully this gives you a few ideas that you can use. As always, thanks a lot for your support. More videos coming soon. Thanks again. Bye for now.